The air in the house felt heavy, thick as the silence that had settled between Stella and George. At 35, Stella felt the weight of every single day, an exhaustion that didn't come from her job or the kids, but from deep within her soul. She looked at George, the man she'd shared a bed, dreams and life with for over a decade, and saw a stranger. At 39, he seemed as distant as the memory of the passionate man who'd once made her believe in forever. Their marriage, she concluded with bitter resignation, was dead. Maybe not officially, with no papers signed or bags packed by the door, but dead in its essence. The house, once a nest of love and laughter, had turned into a minefield. Every conversation was a potential argument, every glance a judgment. The walls seemed to have absorbed the harsh words, the muffled shouts, and the nights of solitary tears. Stella remembered the beginning with painful clarity, the overwhelming passion, the promises whispered in the dark. Where had it all gone? The answer, she knew, was scattered across the last few years, fragmented in events that added up to the ruin they were living in. The 2 pregnancies had been the turning point. The first, with Jack, now 9, was marked by constant nausea and fatigue that knocked her out. George had been a present partner, but in an almost procedural way. He went to the appointments, asked if she was okay, but seemed incapable of understanding the overwhelming transformation happening inside her. The second pregnancy, with Emily, now 7, was even harder. A high-risk one that forced her into near-total bed rest, heightening her isolation. It was after Emily's birth that the darkness swallowed her whole. Postpartum depression hit without warning, a silent thief that stole her colors, her joy, her ability to feel. The baby's cry echoed in her head like an accusation. Her love for the kids was immense, visceral, but it came with a paralyzing guilt for not being the radiant mother she'd idealized. And George? George didn't know what to do. He tried, in his own way. He told her to cheer up, to look on the bright side, to be grateful for their healthy kids. His well-intentioned words sounded like knives, deepening the abyss of misunderstanding between them. She felt invisible. Her body, which had created 2 lives, now seemed like a strange, flabby, marked shell. Desire, once a living flame, had extinguished completely, replaced by chronic fatigue and a deep aversion to touch. Their bed became the ultimate symbol of that distance. A desert of cold sheets, where each turned to their own side, pretending to sleep while separated by an abyss of resentments. George's rare, awkward attempts were met with refusals that he took as personal rejection, not as a symptom of a pain she couldn't even name. Arguments became their only form of communication. They fought over everything and nothing, the wet towel on the bed, the way he talked to the kids, money, silence. Each fight was an excuse to unearth old hurts, a list of failures and disappointments they both knew by heart. He accused her of being cold, of abandoning him. She accused him of being selfish, of never truly seeing her. They were 2 wounded people, attacking each other in hopes of making the other feel a fraction of their own pain. Stella felt herself withering away. The vibrant woman who loved her job, went out with friends, and had plans, had vanished. Now her life was a grey routine, a cycle of caring for the house, the kids, and a marriage that drained her energy. The idea of divorce surfaced in her mind often, a fantasy of liberation. But then she'd look at Jack and Emily, at their innocent faces, and fear paralyzed her. How could she destroy their family? How would she manage everything alone? Guilt and fear were heavy chains, keeping her trapped in that unhappiness. On a rainy Tuesday, after another morning of cutting silence over breakfast, Stella made a decision. It wasn't divorce, not yet. It was something smaller, but it felt like a gigantic step. She scheduled an appointment with a couples therapist. She presented the idea to George that night, not as a request, but as an ultimatum. "Either we go or I'm done," she said, her voice firm, hiding the tremor in her hands. To her surprise, he agreed. Maybe the desperation in her eyes had reached him. The first sessions were disastrous, a festival of mutual accusations, mediated by a patient professional. Stella felt drained after each one, as if she'd relived years of pain in a single hour. George, for his part, seemed resistant, defensive, unable to admit his faults. For Stella, it was just confirmation of the inevitable, the final nail in their marriage's coffin. She had no hope left. She was just going through the motions, so she could tell herself and the kids in the future that she'd tried everything. She prepared for the end. Mentally, she rehearsed the conversations, planned the logistics, imagined life without him. The pain was immense, but there was also a thread of relief in the prospect of finally breathing. What Stella couldn't imagine, not even in her wildest dreams, was that the man sitting beside her on the therapist's couch, the same man who seemed to have forgotten how to love her, was about to undergo a transformation so deep and sudden that it would make her question everything she thought she knew about him, their marriage and reality itself. The end she expected was, in fact, about to give way to a beginning. But a beginning built on a foundation she didn't know, a secret that, once revealed, had the power to be even more devastating than the ruin she already knew. The change didn't happen like thunder, but like a gentle breeze that gradually began to clear the heavy air in the house. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. One morning, a few weeks after starting therapy, George got up before her. When Stella walked into the kitchen, sleepy and already braced for the usual indifference, she found the breakfast table set. It wasn't just coffee brewed. There was fresh bagels, sliced cheese, and the yogurt she liked. He was turned away, packing the kids' lunchboxes, and spun around with a restrained smile. "Good morning, sleep well?" he asked. The question was simple, every day, but the tone was different. There was genuine curiosity there, something she hadn't heard in years. Stella froze for a moment, her heart beating a little faster. Distrust was her first reaction, a defense mechanism honed by years of disappointment. "What does he want?" she thought. She replied with a monosyllable and watched his every move, looking for the trap, the irony, the expectation of something in return. But there was nothing. He just kept arranging things, whistling a random tune, and before leaving for work, he kissed her forehead, a kiss that asked for nothing, just gave itself. In the days that followed, these small gestures began to multiply. George started coming home earlier from work. Instead of flopping on the couch and turning on the TV, he'd walk in, and his first question was, "Need help with anything?" He began handling the kids' baths, helping with homework, putting away the dinner dishes without her having to ask, beg, or start a fight. Stella watched it all with cautious skepticism. She mentioned it to the therapist, who smiled and said maybe he was finally absorbing the sessions, understanding his role and the impact of his absence. The explanation was logical, plausible. Stella wanted to believe it. It was easier to believe in therapy than in the possibility of another reason, one she couldn't control. Gradually, the wall of ice she'd built around herself started showing small cracks. George's transformation wasn't just practical, it was emotional. He started looking her in the eyes during conversations. He asked about her day, not automatically, but with real interest, remembering the name of a co-worker who annoyed her or the project she was working on. One night, during an argument that started over the usual trivial thing, the remote control, something unprecedented happened. In the middle of the barbs, when Stella was already bracing for the escalation of accusations, George stopped, took a deep breath and said, "You're right. I messed up, sorry." The silence that followed was more shocking than any shout. Stella was speechless. George admitting a mistake, apologizing without a but afterward. It was so unthinkable that for a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. He approached, took her hand and said, "I know I've been an absent husband and a jerk most of the time. I'm trying to change, for real." The sincerity in his voice disarmed her completely. That night, for the first time in years, they slept close, not just sharing the same mattress, but sharing a space of truce. Stella's distrust began to give way to a fragile, timid hope, and George seemed determined to nurture that hope. One Friday, she came home exhausted, dreaming only of a shower and her bed. The scene that greeted her in the living room made her stop in the doorway. There was a vase with her favorite flowers, sunflowers, on the coffee table. The smell of food wafted from the kitchen. George appeared, drying his hands on a dish towel with a wide smile. "Surprise. Dinner's on me tonight. Go take a relaxing shower. I'll handle everything." As the hot water from the shower ran over her body, tears mixed with it. They were tears of relief, confusion, a happiness she was afraid to feel. It was too good to be true. The man who barely remembered their anniversary now bought flowers for no reason. The man who considered the kitchen her territory alone now prepared elaborate dinners. He started planning family outings on weekends, picnics in the park, trips to the movies. He remembered dates even she forgot, like the anniversary of their first kiss. Intimacy, once an abandoned battlefield, began to be rebuilt brick by brick. It started with casual touches, a hand on her back as he passed her in the kitchen, a longer hug before leaving. He didn't push for more, seeming to understand she needed time. One night, while watching a movie after the kids were asleep, he put his arm around her shoulders. Stella, instead of stiffening as she would have months before, instinctively nestled into his chest. The warmth of his body, the familiar scent, all seemed new and yet old, a rediscovery of a safe harbor she'd thought lost forever. Desire, which she thought was dead and buried, began to awaken. It was a small, fragile spark, but it was there. She caught herself watching him, noticing how his shirt fit his shoulders, the way he smiled at the kids. She felt desired again. His eyes followed her around the house, not with the old demands, but with admiration, with affection. And when they finally made love, it was different from anything they'd experienced, even in the passionate early days of their relationship. It was tender, patient, a conversation of bodies that said everything words couldn't. He was focused on her pleasure, in a way that made her feel like the only woman in the world. Stella was on cloud 9. She told her friends, who looked at her with a mix of envy and amazement. Therapy worked a miracle, they said, and she agreed. It was the only explanation. George was making an effort, learning, becoming the man she'd always dreamed he could be. The dream marriage, which she'd thought was a fairy tale fantasy, was happening to her in real life. The house was filled with laughter again, complicity returned, peace was restored. She felt guilty for her initial distrust, for doubting him. She felt immense gratitude for this man who seemed to have risen from the ashes of their relationship. He was perfect, attentive, romantic, a present father, a life partner. Everything was exactly as it should be. But sometimes, in moments of silence, a small nagging question arose in the back of her mind, a whisper almost inaudible. The change had been so drastic. The perfection was almost artificial. Where did all that knowledge about her desires come from, about what to say, about how to act? How had a man who'd been emotionally inept for years suddenly become a relationship expert? She pushed those thoughts away quickly, scolding herself for looking for problems where there weren't any. She was happy, immensely happy. Why ruin it with unfounded doubts? It was therapy, of course it was. It couldn't be anything else. She clung to that certainty with all her might, because the alternative was too scary to contemplate. The next 2 years unfolded like scenes from a romantic movie, the kind that make you sigh. Stella's happiness shifted from a fragile hope to a solid certainty, firm ground under her feet. The house, once a stage for silences and resentments, was now filled with constant harmony. The kids' laughter echoed through the hallways, mixing with the calm conversations and affectionate gestures between her and George. Couples therapy, the catalyst for that miraculous transformation, became a distant memory. It was George who first suggested they stop the sessions. "I think we've learned what we needed to, honey," he said, hugging her waist while she made coffee. "And we could use that money we're spending every month and save for a family vacation. What do you think?" Stella hesitated for a brief moment. The therapist had been her anchor in the storm, and the idea of letting go sent a slight chill down her spine. But looking at the man in front of her, at the sparkle in his eyes and the confidence in his smile, she gave in. He was right. The work was done. The professional had been brilliant, a true artisan who'd rebuilt the foundations of their marriage. She felt eternal gratitude for that woman who, in her view, had given back her husband and her happiness. Life together flowed with a lightness Stella never thought possible. George was the embodiment of the perfect husband. He didn't just maintain the romantic gestures, he seemed to perfect them. Flowers for no reason became a habit. Surprise dinners, a delightful routine. He seemed to have a radar for her moods. On days she came home from work with the weight of the world on her shoulders, He'd greet her with a bubble bath drawn, or her favorite dessert. He encouraged her to go out with friends, to have her own space, saying her happiness made him happy. During that time, George's workload seemed to increase. He came home later some nights during the week. At first, an old pang of anxiety threatened Stella, a ghost memory from the days of abandonment. But George had an infallible antidote for any suspicion. He never came empty-handed. If he walked through the door at 9 at night, he brought a single rose, a chocolate she loved, or the action figure Jack had seen in the store window days before. "Sorry for being late, babe. The day was crazy, but I didn't stop thinking about you guys," he'd say, and the fatigue on his face seemed to validate every word. How could she doubt a man who, even exhausted, showed his family was his first thought? Those small tokens weren't just gifts. They were proofs of love, seals of his dedication. Stella saw it as his sacrifice for the family's well-being, an effort to give them a better life. The business trips also became more frequent. They were always short, 1 or 2 days at most, to nearby cities. And paradoxically, each return seemed to strengthen the marriage even more. George came back with renewed energy, more passionate and attentive than ever. He'd shower her with kisses, hug the kids with palpable longing, and spend the next weekend entirely dedicated to them, as if making up for every minute away. For Stella, those trips were just more proof of the dedicated professional he was, and the way he came home only reinforced the image of the exemplary husband and father. Life was good. It was beautiful. It was everything she'd ever wanted. Stella felt fulfilled, loved and secure. The past of pain and depression seemed to belong to another life, to another woman she barely recognized. Her trust in George was absolute, unshakable, until one Thursday night. They were in the living room, the kids already asleep. Stella was reading a book curled up on the couch while George answered some work emails on his laptop. The atmosphere was one of perfect domestic peace. Suddenly, his phone on the coffee table vibrated and lit up. Stella, on autopilot without thinking, reached out to grab it and hand it to him. "Honey, your phone," she said, her eyes still on the device. The instant her fingers touched the phone, George's reaction was like lightning in a clear sky. He jumped up, his body tense, and snatched the phone from her hand with a speed that scared her. The movement was abrupt, almost violent, and completely disproportionate to the situation. "I'll get it," he said, his voice a tone higher and sharper than normal. Stella recoiled, her heart racing from the shock. She stared at him, confused. He looked at the phone screen, answered with forced formality, "Hello? Yes, boss. I understand," and walked away, going to the balcony to continue the conversation. She sat there, frozen on the couch, the book forgotten in her lap. The peace in the room had shattered into 1,000 pieces. It wasn't the call. It was his boss she'd heard. It was the reaction, the panic in his eyes, the way he'd yanked the device from her hand as if she was about to uncover a state secret. Why the fuss? It was just the phone. She never snooped through his things. She had no reason to. His fear made no sense. When George came back into the room minutes later, his face wore a tense smile. "Sorry, babe. Urgent work stuff. You know how it is." He tried to hug her, but Stella felt a stiffness in her own body. She pulled away a little, enough to look him in the eyes. "Why did you grab the phone like that, George? It was like I was going to eat it." He laughed, a nervous sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Your imagination. I was just in the middle of an important email thought, got startled by the ring. It was impulse, it was nothing." He tried to downplay it, turn the episode into a triviality, but the image of his panicked face was etched in Stella's mind. That brief instant of uncontrolled tension had torn the veil of perfection. For the first time in 2 years, the seed of doubt, which she'd thought eradicated forever, was planted again in her heart. A tiny flea, almost invisible but terribly annoying, had just settled behind her ear, and she knew with an intuition awakening from a long sleep that flea wouldn't leave her alone any time soon. The perfect dream had just shown its first and perhaps fatal crack. That incident, though brief, was like a stone thrown into the calm surface of a lake. The ripples of discomfort and suspicion spread through the following days, disturbing the peace Stella cherished so much. She tried to convince herself that George was right, that it had just been an overreaction to work stress. But the image of his panic was burned into her retina. The harmony of the house, once so natural, now seemed fragile, forced. Stella found herself observing her husband with an analytical eye she hadn't used in years. Every gesture, every word, every look from him was now filtered through a new lens of distrust. She noticed how protective he was with his phone. The device was always in his pocket or face down. If he went to the bathroom, the phone went with him. If he went to the kitchen for a glass of water, the phone accompanied him. It was subtle, but for Stella, now on high alert, it was a clear sign that something was being hidden. Curiosity, mixed with growing anxiety, became torture. She fought the urge to snoop, feeling guilty for even considering invading the privacy of the man who, until a week ago, was the embodiment of trust. What if it's a work problem, she thought, trying to find a noble justification. Maybe he's having financial troubles and doesn't want to worry me. That possibility anguished her, but it was preferable to the alternative her mind was treacherously starting to sketch. One night, temptation won. She waited until George's breathing became deep and regular, the familiar sound of his heavy sleep. With her heart pounding unevenly in her chest, she slipped out of bed, her body moving with the caution of a thief. She grabbed his phone from the nightstand, the cold metal against her sweaty skin, and retreated to the living room, the only light coming from a lamp in the corner. She tried the old password, their wedding anniversary date. Incorrect password. She tried her birthday, the kids. Nothing. He'd changed it. The confirmation hit her like a punch to the gut. Why? Why would he change the password he'd used for years? Suspicion stopped being a flea and became a roaring monster in her mind. It wasn't a work problem. Work problems didn't require that much secrecy at home. There was something more. Stella knew she needed to uncover the truth. The uncertainty was more painful than any reality, no matter how bad. In the following days, she turned into a spy in her own home. She pretended normalcy, smiled, kissed him, but her eyes were always watchful, waiting for an opportunity. The chance came on a Saturday afternoon. They were in the living room, and she, with rehearsed casualness, asked him to look up the trailer for a movie she wanted to see with the kids. "Search it on your phone, honey. Mine's charging in the bedroom." He picked up the device, and in the brief instant, his fingers slid across the screen to enter the unlock code. Stella's eyes were fixed, memorizing the pattern. That night, the wait was agonizing. Every minute until he fell asleep felt like an eternity. When she was finally sure he was in deep sleep, she repeated the ritual. She grabbed the phone, went to the living room, and sat in the same armchair, which now felt like a defendant's bench. With trembling fingers, she entered the code. The device unlocked. Her heart stopped for a second and then raced into a frantic sprint. Access was there, a universe of information in the palm of her hand. Where to start? Photo gallery? Emails? The messaging app seemed the most obvious place. She opened it. The list of chats looked normal at first glance. Family groups, buddies from the softball league, work colleagues. Nothing out of the ordinary. A momentary relief washed over her. Maybe I'm crazy, she thought. But intuition, that persistent voice, wouldn't let her give up. She remembered reading somewhere about hidden folders, archived conversations. Her fingers, almost acting on their own, slid across the screen, searching for a feature, a hidden menu. And then she found it. A small tab, almost unnoticeable, called Archived Chats. She tapped it, and Stella's world collapsed. There wasn't one, but dozens of conversations, and one in particular, at the top of the list, had a history that seemed endless. The contact name was Amanda. Her heart froze. Who was Amanda? The profile picture was of a smiling woman with dark hair, appearing to be around her age. Stella opened the chat. The date of the first message took her breath away. Almost 2 years ago. Exactly when George's miraculous transformation had begun. She started reading. At first she didn't understand properly. The messages were about her, about their marriage. George complained, vented about the fights, the lack of intimacy, her depression. And Amanda responded, but not like a friend offering a shoulder. She gave advice. No, they were more than advice. They were instructions. "You need to be more patient, George. She's going through a tough time," said an old message. "Why don't you buy the flowers she likes? Sunflowers, you told me. A simple gesture can change her day." Stella felt the air leave her lungs. The sunflowers, the first gesture that had made her believe in his change. It wasn't spontaneous. It was suggested. She kept scrolling, her breath suspended, her eyes devouring the words that were rewriting her history. "Don't argue with her when she's tired. Make dinner. Tell her she's right. Apologize, even if you think you're not wrong." That's called emotional intelligence, something you need to develop. The apology, the surprise dinner, the phrase, "you're right." It was all there. Every gesture, every affectionate word, every action that had made her fall in love with him again hadn't come from him. It had been scripted by another woman. Hours passed, but Stella didn't feel them. She was trapped in that vortex of revelations, scrolling through 3 years of messages. It was over 50 hours of reading, she'd calculate later, a marathon of pain that was breaking her inside. She saw the planning of her birthdays, the choice of her gifts, the suggestions for weekend getaways. She saw Amanda criticizing George, calling him stubborn and immature, then guiding him like a teacher instructing a reluctant student. Her happiness, her dream marriage, the rebuilding of her family. It was all a well-rehearsed play, where she was the only audience member who didn't know the script. And the worst was yet to come. She still didn't know who Amanda was, or the depth of the relationship between her and her husband. But one thing was certain. The world she knew had just been imploded, and she was standing alone amid the smoking rubble of a life that had never truly been hers. The initial shock, sharp and paralyzing, gave way to a cold nausea rising slowly up Stella's throat. The words on the phone screen seemed to twist, dancing before her eyes, as uncontrollable tears fell silently, staining the cold glow of the device. Each message her eyes devoured was a new blow, a new piece forced into the puzzle of her life, revealing a final image that was a monumental farce. The man sleeping the sleep of the just in the bedroom next door wasn't the reborn husband she'd learned to love with renewed devotion. He was a puppet whose invisible strings were skillfully pulled by a woman named Amanda. Discovering that her happiness had been meticulously scripted was devastating in itself. But Stella's mind, even amid the chaos and pain, desperately sought an explanation that could somehow mitigate the horror. Maybe Amanda was a psychologist, a relationship coach George had secretly hired, too ashamed to admit his failings. That hypothesis, though bizarre, still painted him as a desperate man, fighting to save his marriage through hidden means. It was a fragile, almost rotten lifeline, but Stella clung to it with the strength of a drowning person, while her trembling fingers continued scrolling down the conversation, diving deeper into the abyss. The identity of the mysterious mentor didn't take long to materialize. Among the guidance messages, Stella found photos. A selfie of Amanda with her husband and a smiling boy, a teenager, captioned, "Family Day at the Park." Stella zoomed in on the woman's face. It was the same as the profile picture, in her 40s, with a smile that seemed genuine and eyes that conveyed an almost maternal calm. Amanda was married, and a mother. The revelation, instead of bringing any relief, only intensified the doubt. The irony of the situation was atrociously cruel. On the other side of the city, or perhaps the country, there was another woman, Amanda, who also complained about a marriage without intimacy, an absent husband, and in her own loneliness she found purpose in becoming the savior of George's marriage. She taught him to be the husband she perhaps wished she had. And George, the diligent student, absorbed every lesson and replicated it at home. He wasn't transforming, he was imitating. And the performance had been so convincing that it fooled everyone, especially her, Stella, who'd fallen head over heels for the character, not the man. If the story ended there, it would already be an unbearable tragedy. But Stella kept reading, driven by a masochistic need to know the full extent of those conversations. And what she found in the most recent messages, from the last few months, destroyed the last fiber of hope she clung to. The relationship between George and Amanda wasn't just bizarre coaching. It had turned into something much more intimate, much more dangerous. Amid the advice and criticisms, the language changed. Subtle flirts became bold. Compliments on her intelligence turned into compliments on her beauty. Then came the intimate photos, the exchanged selfies, the complicit smiles. And finally the declarations of love, unequivocal, explicit, each one a stab to Stella's heart. "I love you, Amanda. You're the woman of my life," said a message from George, sent during one of his business trips. Her reply came minutes later. "I love you too, George. You're my soulmate, but we both know we can't do this. We have our families." Stella had to drop the phone. Air wasn't entering her lungs. She bent over, her stomach contracting violently, the sound of her suffering muffled by the convulsive sobs shaking her. The betrayal was double, triple, a multi-headed monster. George wasn't just fooling her with a performance. He was cheating on her with the architect of that same performance. The perfect husband she had at home was a product created and maintained by the love he felt for another woman, his lover. With shaking hands, she picked up the phone one last time and read the exchange from that night just hours before. "Stella's so happy. Sometimes the guilt crushes me," he wrote. "You're doing the right thing," Amanda replied. "What we have is ours, a separate world. No one needs to get hurt. Now go sleep with your wife. And remember to give her a good morning kiss tomorrow. She likes that." The last message was the final blow. The woman declaring love to her husband was the same one instructing him to kiss her in the morning. They saw themselves as noble, sacrificing their soulmate for a greater good, when in reality they were just cowards, building a castle of lies on the ignorance of their spouses. Stella sat in the dark, the phone forgotten in her lap, the screen now off. The sun would start rising in a few hours. The house routine would soon begin. And George, the award-winning actor, the lover of another, would wake up and, following his beloved's instructions, lean in to give her a kiss. But the woman he'd kiss wouldn't be the same as the night before. The Stella who existed a few hours ago was dead, buried under the rubble of a life of lies. The woman sitting in the living room, cold and empty, was another. A woman with a heart in shards, but with eyes, for the first time in a long time, terribly open. The romantic movie was over. And she knew with icy certainty that the final act was about to begin. And this time she wouldn't be just a spectator. The silence of the early morning was a heavy blanket over the house, but inside Stella, a storm raged, devastating everything that had once been sacred. The crying had stopped, replaced by a cold, cutting clarity. She didn't sleep. She remained motionless in the living room armchair, the epicenter of the earthquake that had imploded her life, as the first lights of dawn painted the sky in shades of grey and violet. Stella got up, put the phone back on his nightstand. Her movements were deliberate, almost robotic. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. Instead, she quietly slipped on a pair of sneakers, grabbed her keys, and left, closing the front door with an almost inaudible click. The cold morning air hit her face, a welcome shock reminding her she was still alive, breathing. She had no destination. She just walked, her legs carrying her through slowly awakening empty streets. Each step was an attempt to distance herself from the woman she'd been the night before, the happy wife, the fulfilled mother, the fooled fool. With every block, she felt the pain transform into something harder, sharper. A icy rage began to crystallize over the shards of her heart. Her phone vibrated in her pocket. It was him. "Good morning, my love. Woke up and didn't see you. Where are you?" The hypocrisy of those words, "my love," almost made her laugh. Her fingers, surprisingly steady, typed a reply. "Went out for an early walk. Needed some air. Please give the kids breakfast and take them to school. I'll be back later." She sent the message and turned off the device, cutting the last thread connecting her to his farce. Let him play his role. Let him be the perfect father, the attentive husband, just one more time. The show had to go on, but the one-person audience had left the theater. When she finally returned, the house was silent. He'd already left for work, leaving behind the impeccable order of a happy home. The breakfast dishes were washed, the kids' beds made. It was the scene of a perfect crime, with no traces of the betrayal hanging in the air like an invisible poison. Stella stopped in the middle of the living room, the silence amplifying the buzz in her ears. Her eyes landed on a picture frame on the shelf. In it, Jack and Emily, 9 and 7, smiled at the camera, their faces the pure image of innocence, oblivious to the web of lies holding their world together. That photo was the only truth left. It was them. They were the reason the pain was so deep and the decision so impossible. A whirlwind of possibilities assaulted her. The first, the most visceral, was to expose everything. To rip off George's mask and Amanda's. To call her husband, a stranger whose world was about to be destroyed, and tell him every sordid detail. She imagined the scene. The admiration George and Amanda felt for themselves, their self-image as noble martyrs, crumbling into public humiliation. The idea of destroying their false peace was a tempting balm for her own agony. But then she looked at the photo again, at her kids' smiles. An open war would leave deep scars on them. What would come after the explosion? A contentious divorce, asset division, shared custody, the pain of explaining to the kids that the father they adored was a liar, and the mother, a betrayed woman. The future, once a sunny and predictable road, was now a dark, unknown abyss. She was on the edge, with the wind of uncertainty blowing in her face. One path led to revenge, a cathartic explosion that could consume everyone, including herself. The other, quieter and perhaps more terrifying, led to a fresh start. A solitary path where she'd have to pick up her own pieces and rebuild a life from scratch for herself and her kids. In that moment, looking at her children's faces, Stella knew she needed to be smarter than ever. The next scene wouldn't be written by Amanda, nor directed by George. The script, for the first time, was in her hands, and the first act was about to begin. That same afternoon, with her heart still in tatters but her mind sharpened by the adrenaline of betrayal, Stella made a call. Not to a friend, not to her mum. She called the couple's therapist, the woman she'd once credited with the miracle, and who now, unknowingly, was a central piece on the board of her pain. She needed perspective, a neutral guide before taking the next step in the minefield her life had become. The session was a feverish monologue, where Stella poured out the whole story, every message, every lie, every detail of the farce. The therapist listened, shock and compassion stamped on her face, not offering solutions, but helping Stella organize the chaos in her mind, separate pain from anger, the victim from the woman who needed to act. When night fell, bringing George's return home with it, the air was charged with palpable electricity. He walked in smiling, the perfect husband returning to his sanctuary, but the smile died on his lips when he found Stella sitting in the living room armchair, the same one where she'd discovered everything, with an expression he'd never seen before. It wasn't anger, it wasn't sadness. It was a terrifying calm, the calm of a hurricane's eye. "We need to talk," she said, and the tone of her voice made George's blood run cold. She didn't yell. She didn't accuse him right away. With surgical precision, she began narrating the story of their marriage over the last few years. She spoke of the sunflowers, the surprise dinners, the exact phrases he used to calm her, the birthday gifts, the weekend getaways. With each detail she mentioned, George's face paled, confusion giving way to panic. He didn't understand how she could know everything with such accuracy. And then she delivered the final blow. "I know about Amanda," she said, and the name spoken aloud in that room for the first time seemed to suck all the air from the space. "I know every gesture of yours wasn't spontaneous, it was instructed. I know every affectionate word was a script. And I know that while I believed our marriage was being saved, my life, my pains, my intimacy were being exposed and debated with your lover." The word lover hit him like a punch. George opened his mouth to deny, to defend himself, but no words came out. The shock of being discovered, of having his web of lies unraveled thread by thread, left him mute. "I felt humiliated," Stella continued, her voice steady, though each word was a knife in her own chest. "Humiliated for being deceived, for falling in love with a farce. And most importantly, humiliated for having my life turned into a case study for the woman you were cheating on me with. For now, I'll stay here. We have 2 kids who don't deserve to be dragged into this clown show. But don't fool yourself, George. Our marriage, whatever you thought it was, ended tonight." She got up and went to the guest room, leaving him paralyzed in the middle of the living room, an unmasked man on the stage of his own theater. The weeks that followed were a blur of silent tension, but while George sank into his shock and guilt, something new awakened in Stella. The energy she'd once spent trying to decipher her husband and keep the peace, she now redirected to herself. The pain, instead of paralyzing her, became fuel. She joined a gym, not to win him back, but to reclaim her own body, to feel the strength in her muscles, to sweat out the anger and sadness. She dove into work with renewed focus, and her competence, once overshadowed by domestic fog, shone brightly, resulting in a promotion that surprised her. She wasn't living on crumbs of attention anymore. She was feasting on a banquet of self-discovery. She looked in the mirror, and for the first time in years, didn't see the tired mum or the rejected wife. She saw a woman, a beautiful, powerful woman who'd survived the unthinkable and was just beginning to understand the size of her own strength. As for Amanda, the anonymous arsonist of her life, Stella made a decision that shocked even herself. She didn't seek revenge. She didn't call her husband. In one last message sent from George's phone, which he'd left on the table, Stella wrote just one sentence to the other woman. "I know everything. Instead of trying to fix other people's lives, maybe you should take care of your own. You're going to need to." And with that, she deleted her. Not just from the chat, but from her life. Amanda didn't deserve rival status. She was just a sad footnote in the story of her rediscovery. The real journey, the hardest and most important, was just beginning. And Stella, for the first time, felt genuine curiosity and even a hint of excitement about what the future held. 3 months, 90 days that dragged like years and flew like seconds. For George, they were 90 days of deafening silence, inhabiting a house that had become a hollow shell, a mausoleum of the marriage he'd murdered himself. For Stella, they were 90 days of a dizzying metamorphosis. The woman who'd cried on the living room floor gave way to a figure she barely recognized in the mirror, stronger, leaner, with a shine in her eyes that didn't come from marital happiness, but from a newfound and unshakable self-esteem. The promotion at work wasn't just a salary bump. It was the key that opened the cage door. With financial independence firmly in her hands, Stella made the final decision. She found an apartment, a bright and airy place without ghosts, and rented it. It would be hers and the kids, a new beginning on a blank canvas. The final conversation with George didn't have the fire of the first. It was calm, almost melancholic, making it even more definitive. He watched her pack the last of the kids' belongings, his face marked by loss, the posture of a defeated man. "I found a place for us," she said, without looking at him directly. "It's time for you to figure yourself out, George, to discover who you are without a script, without an alibi. This double life you tried to lead, it doesn't make sense, not for you, not for me, and certainly not for them." She gestured toward the kids' room. "They deserve the truth. And the truth is that for now, our family needs to live in separate houses." Each word was a nail in the coffin of his hope. Stella's departure was a blow, but seeing the boxes with Jack's toys and Emily's books being carried out was the real torture. The silence after they left was absolute, a vacuum echoing his failure. Shame was his only companion. He, who'd seen himself as the heroic savior of his marriage, now saw himself as he truly was. A coward who'd lost everything for lacking the courage to be honest with himself. Regret consumed him. In an act of desperation and clarity, he picked up the phone and ended everything with Amanda. The conversation was brief, devoid of the false intimacy that had bound them. The relationship that seemed like a safe harbor revealed itself as what it always was, a toxic anchor preventing him from facing himself. He was alone, completely, humiliated, broken, but with a spark of determination that didn't come from a script. George made the call he should have made on his own years before. He scheduled a session with the therapist. Alone. This time, there was no performance. There was only the raw truth of a man who looked in the mirror and hated what he saw. He dedicated himself to the sessions with a ferocity he'd never had, not to learn how to please, but to learn how to understand himself. Months later, Stella watched her kids running in a park near her new apartment. She was at peace. Not a euphoric peace, but a serene one. The peace of someone who knows she's exactly where she should be. From afar, she saw a familiar figure approaching. It was George. He didn't come near her, just stayed at a respectful distance, watching the kids with genuine sadness in his eyes. Her phone vibrated, a message from him. "I know it might be too late," the text said, "and I know I have no right to ask for anything, but I needed you to know. That man who deceived you, I'm trying to kill him every day. I'm doing this for me, but the truth is that the image of you three is the only thing driving me. I don't know what the future holds, Stella, but I'll fight to be a man worthy of your forgiveness, and I'll try to win back my family no matter what it takes." Stella read the message, her heart beating a little harder. She looked at him, across the grass, and then at her kids, laughing under the sun. She didn't smile, but she didn't feel anger either. For the first time, she didn't know what the future held. Their story hadn't ended with a period, but with an ellipsis. A silent promise that perhaps the hardest and truest journey of all was just beginning. And so, the story of Stella and George reaches a crossroads. The future, once an abyss of uncertainty, now opens with a fragile yet real possibility. Each of their journeys has just begun. Stella, reborn from the ashes of a life that wasn't hers, found her strength and her peace. George, stripped of his masks and lies, starts the painful path of self-discovery and genuine regret. The story ends here because I want to hear your opinions. If you were in Stella's place, after all the humiliation, manipulation, and betrayal, what would you do? Do you believe a man can truly change so deeply? Would you one day forgive George, not just as the father of your children, but as the man of your life? Or would you move forward, head held high, and never look back, closing the door on that love forever? Leave your opinion in the comments.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.